Hi class, so in this video I'm going to talk about adding some different variations to the pattern, the grid pattern that we made in the last video. And then I'll also just quickly demonstrate adding in the user interface elements to allow our user to generate the pattern and then save it. So I'm going to do a few examples here, and I think this was a little confusing last time because I had like you can see over here I had meme 1, 2, 3, and 4, but meme 3 and 4 were really just different variations of the final project for this for that meme project. For this one I'm going to do different examples, and they kind of are going to demonstrate different components. So I'm going to start one with our regular XY loop. I'm going to start one with the translate loop. And then I'm also going to do one where I do some different shape variations. So I'm going to label them. I just want to make it clear that it's not required for you to do different versions. You can choose sort of which one you find more interesting to apply to your own assignment, or you can kind of mix and match if you want to do that. So I'm just going to do a few different examples. So I'm going to start one with the nested loop. I'm going to call this pattern 3A. Okay. And then I'm going to start one with the translate. So I'm going to duplicate that. And I'm going to call that one pattern 3B. So I just want to show doing some variation in both of those cases. Hopefully it won't be too confusing, but I'm going to do different types of variation. So you can really apply different types of variation in different contexts. That doesn't matter too much. But the approach that you'll take will be different. So if you do want to kind of like do different stuff, you may want to ask me how I would approach it, or if you get started and you get lost or something like that, you can always ask me. So I'm going to go back to my Sublime text and open up index.html. And so I have pattern version 1 and 2. So my pattern 1, let's take a look at that just to recap. So in pattern 1, I just kind of made a simple pattern with a little bit of variation where we see different colors on the faces and we see this kind of more abstract lines and circles in the background. In pattern version 2, I added this user interface so that the user can adjust the pattern and change the color palette and move the eyes around and move the circles up and down and kind of generate new patterns and then save the pattern at the end. So we're going to add some, at least the pattern and save image button, but some of the variation will actually just be creating through our code, and then can add user interface elements as well. Let's create links for the new version. So say list item class equals link. And so this one is going to be pattern 3A. So this is pattern version 3A. And same thing, I'm just going to copy and paste that one, 3B. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to start with 3A. And I'm just going to say this is pattern version 3. 3A. And pattern version 3A. So just remember, you only have to do one example for the final project. You don't have to do multiple examples. I'm just giving you guys some different options for how to approach. So in 3A, I'm just going to change the name up here to pattern version 3. So this one, we're using the X and Y and the width and height variables. So there's no translate in this one. So our variations are going to be relative to these points. So I'm going to show a couple different types of variations, and I'm going to simplify the example a little bit just to make it so that you guys can kind of start in a more simplified place. So I'm going to get rid of my ellipse here, and I'm just going to do, to start, a rectangle at X, Y, width, and height. Okay, so when we look at this example, this is pattern version 3A. So it's just completely filled in white because my rectangles are all basically the same color. They're all white, and they all completely fill up the grid. So we really actually can't see the grid at all right now. If we take off the stroke, we'll be able to see that. So if we add the stroke back in, now you can see that. So I'm actually gonna, for this one, I'm gonna work a lot more with the variables because you can get a lot more interesting stuff happening with that in terms of creating abstraction. And I'm even gonna add some other, control statements in here as well. So let's leave the stroke on. So I'm just gonna start off with some color variation. So that way we can start to see where these different rectangles are. So it's pretty easy to do some random colors. We've seen other examples of this. So we need red, green, and blue values. And I'm just going to make these variables inside of my while loop because I'm going to be recreating them each time I go through the loop. So let's make some red. So we'll say let R for red is random. And let's do just a little bit of red. So we'll say 0 to 100. And then we'll make a G variable for the green. And we'll do something similar, maybe a little bit more green possibly. So remember, for colors, our max value is 255. So by limiting this range, we limit the amount of that color that we'll see in the random result. And finally for B, we're going to say random from 0 to 255. So we're going to have a full amount of blue possible. So then I'll just do fill R, G, and B. And so now we'll be able to see all of our different rectangles. That obviously looks really crazy, which is a good point at which to remember that we need to turn this into a pattern and not a draw function. So let's call this pattern. And I'll rename the draw function pattern so it only happens once. And then we'll make our little button to refresh it. So I'm just going to say variable pattern button equals create button pattern, and then we'll say pattern button dot mouse pressed, and then we'll give it the pattern function so we can redraw our pattern each time. And good thing our styles are still here, so we can see that button with the styling we did previously. So actually, I'm not a big fan of this color palette. I think there's a bit too much green, so let's move the green down a bit. Okay, that looks a little bit better. And there's also too many dark colors, so I'm actually going to raise the floor of the blue a little bit just to make sure that all of our colors are sort of in a blue range. So you can play around with these variables a little bit to get different values. We can also make our pattern a little bit more complex if we change the width. So I'm going to make the width much smaller so we have a lot more shapes in our pattern. Okay, so now we can start to see a little bit more of the color variation. There's actually more red than I want, so I'm going to bring the red down even more. There we go. So now we have a lot of blues. So that's one type of variation. We're just adding some random values here. What I'm going to show, I'm going to do one more type of variation, and then I'm going to start to show using some other control structures. So all of our rectangles are kind of in the same place right now. But what if we wanted to vary the x and y values a little bit? We have x here, we have y here, but I can just throw a random value right there. So I can say x plus random, and I'll just use a small number here. Okay, so now we see some variation in the x. That's kind of cool. And we can say y plus random 10. And now we see some variation there as well. So we're starting to see you can very quickly add a bit of variation. And we can even do that with the size of our shape. So I can say width plus random and height plus random. So you can add a random number anywhere you want and create some variations. And the bigger those random numbers are, the more variation you'll see. So I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger because it's harder to see those variations. Okay, so now we still have basically the same type of shape, but what if I make this width, or let's actually do the height. What if I make the height 100 random? We don't actually see a lot of variation there because our shapes are all covering each other up. So what if we just completely replace the height with random 100? Okay, so now you start to see some very thin shapes and some wider shapes. So we can start to play around with that. Maybe I'll say 50 or height over 2 plus random. So there's sort of like a limit to that. So we can bring some variation there as well. Okay, so we've got sort of this abstract look going on. We can start to try to add some more variation to it that's a little bit more, that's kind of like takes different parts of the composition into account. So we're just kind of adding some random numbers here, but what if we started to think about the overall composition instead of just each individual cell? Like I could make part of my composition a completely different color if I wanted to say like this is the sky and this is maybe like a beach or something like that. Maybe we can change the color here. So I can begin to use some control structures to do that. So that gets a little bit more complicated in terms of what our code looks like, but it can give us a lot more interesting variations. We have our red, green, blue, and let's just say if we pass a certain threshold on the Y, so if we move a certain amount down this way, then we'll start to change our colors a little bit. So I'll say if Y is greater than, let's say this is maybe about 300. Then let's add a bit more red and green. So I'm just going to say red plus equals random 100 to 200. And green plus equals random, let's do a little bit more red than green, so I'll say like 50 to 150. So now we see that the random colors up here have a different palette than our random colors down here. So we can kind of create different parts of our composition. Okay, so now let's give the user a little bit more control over the design. So I'm going to create the save button as well, just to review that. So I'm going to say variable save button equals create button save, and I'm just going to say save button dot mouse pressed, and we'll create a save image function for that. So then I'll just say function save image. And basically whenever we call that, I'm just going to save a file called pattern.png. So we'll just save our pattern. Okay, so now let's give the user control over some aspect of the pattern. So we can start just simple, giving them control over the width of a cell. Okay, so let's make a slider for that. So I'll say variable width. And so instead of creating our width here, we're just going to use the width slider. So I'm going to say w equals create slider. And so we'll say our minimum value, if we say 0, we may actually get a problem right here. Whereas if we're incrementing by 0, we can get a stack overflow, because if we're not changing x by anything, then this condition will never be satisfied. So our minimum value has to be at least 1 to avoid a stack overflow of our computer. So we'll start with 1, and then let's say the biggest value is like 100. And then we'll start at where we were before, so 40. And then we'll just plug in that w value into anything that uses w. So that is the width here, or actually let's just change this to a name. So let's call this w slider for width slider. And this will be a little simpler if I just leave w there and just assign it the value. So w slider.value. That way I don't have to go through and update each one of my w's down here. Oh, and I did the thing again where I forgot to put pattern at the bottom after we make all of our buttons and sliders. Okay, so now we can update the pattern. But let's call pattern each time we move the slider. So I'll say wSlider.input and call pattern. And so now we'll see if we move it to this way, we get larger shapes, and if we move it to this way, we're getting smaller and smaller, and eventually our shapes are going to start to, we're going to be drawing so many shapes that it's actually going to slow down the computer a little bit. It's not too bad. You can see it takes it a little while to generate the pattern. But as we get smaller, you can see that that discrepancy in the height and width starts to really make a big difference in terms of the number of shapes. So that's actually pretty cool once we get down past like maybe 5 pixels. I'm not sure exactly what that value is. But we see a lot of variation there. And so once you start playing with that, you might start to think about other ways that you can vary what you're seeing on the screen. I kind of want to get rid of a little bit of blue, so I'm going to say B minus equals random between 100 and 200. Okay, so now we have a little bit more variation between our top color and our bottom color. So that's kind of nice. So let's actually put that slider at the top. So I'm just going to move this slider up here, and I'm just going to give it a label. I'm going to say create P, and I'll just call this cell size. So we can change the cell size. Okay, so then we can also change, I'm just going to do one more variation here, and then I'll move to the other demo. So another thing that we can change that's very simple that will add to a lot of difference is, or add to a very identifiable difference, is this line right here. So if we want to design this pattern, we could move that line down further, we could move it up. So let's figure out what that line is. It's this number right here. So let's just make a slider for that line. So I'm going to say variable, let's call this height slider. And I'm going to say, I'm just going to give this a label height, just kind of give it some context. And I'm going to say height slider equals create slider. So this one we can make any value. It's not part of the loop, so we don't really have to worry about breaking the loop. So it can go as low as 0. And if it goes above the height of the canvas here, it's not going to really be visible. So I'll just use height as the top value, and I'll start where it started down here, which is 300. 300. And I'll do the same thing that I did here by adding the input, the pattern to the input. That way the pattern will update whenever I move the slider. So I'll say height slider.input pattern. And so now, since this 300 is here and I don't use it anywhere else, I'm just going to throw the value for that height slider right there. So I'm going to say height slider.value, and that will give me the current value of the slider. And so we should be able to see this line right here move. So I'll save that. So if I move the height, yeah, so we can see that color where that starts moves up and down. And actually, I guess we have to go a little bit negative if we want to get past that 0. So maybe for this one, we'll say -10. I think maybe even -1 would work, but yeah, now we can get there. Okay, so now we can change the color that way, but then we can also change the cell size. And again, if once we get a lot of cells, it starts, the whole program starts to slow down. So somewhere around there, you might want to figure out what that is and prevent the user from going too far down. But that's kind of fun, and once you choose a pattern that you like, we can generate different versions of it, and then we can save it. So that's one kind of approach. You can create something abstract, add more shapes in there, maybe use circles or arcs or things like that. So I'm going to stop here with this version. For 3B, I'm going to take a slightly different approach, but I'm going to show some similar ideas. So you could kind of combine them or do them in different ways, but you guys can kind of figure that out once you're coming up with your idea. Okay, so that was 3A. Let's look at 3B now. So 3B, we're using a slightly different way of working. So I'm going to close this out. and go to 3B. And I'm just going to change the title of the HTML page to pattern version 3B. Pattern version 3B. And let's open up Sketch. Change this title here. And so with this one, we're not really using X and Y, we're just using translate for that. So for this one, I'm still going to use these width and height variables, but I'm going to make a little bit of a different approach here, where instead of varying color and position, which you could add them together if you want, but for this one, I'm just going to be varying the type of shapes. And so I'm going to have to use another control structure for this, and we'll see where we go with that. So I'm just going to delete what I have here and start again with our simple rectangle. So I'm just going to say rectangle 0, 0, width and height. Okay, so we're just going to draw a rectangle for each cell. Okay, and again, it's just like a big grid where we can't actually see because each rectangle is kind of filling in the whole space. So we can draw other shapes besides the rectangle. And to make some kind of interesting different patterns, we can choose what shape we want to draw. So let's just draw a few shapes, some simple shapes, and then we can see how to combine them. So I'm going to start really simple with some lines. So I'm going to say line, and I'm going to go from 0, 0 to width and height. And that will give me, oh, I don't have a stroke. So let's say stroke is green. Okay, so that gives me all these lines, and they look like they're connecting, but they're actually just going like through each cell, and then this cell connects here. Okay, so that's one line. Okay, so if I want to make the opposite of that line, I can say a line from 0 to height and width height. So, okay, not the opposite, but so remember this is 0, 0, and then this is W, this is H, so width height is down here. So width height here to 0 height there. Okay, that's another line that we can make. I can also make a line going in the other direction. I can say width and 0 to width height. Okay, so that's kind of a line that's going from width, which is here, and 0y, to width down here and height on the y. So we're just kind of using the width and height. So we're not really changing these values much. We're just kind of using the default values. And so then let's make one more line. And so we went this way, we went this way, and this way. I want to go that way. So I want to go from width and 0 to 0 and height. Okay, so width, 0, 0, and height. Okay, so now we've got basically all the variations of lines we might want here. And I'm actually going to increase the cell size a bit so we can look at this again. So the reason this works is, let's look at that code too. Okay, so the reason this works is, so 0, 0 is here, but then since we're translating to X and Y, 0, 0 is here, then it's here, then it's here, then here, 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 and here. And for each time we have 0, 0, we also have width and height. And so this line is going from 0, 0 here to width height down here. This one is going from 0 height, so we go down to height, X is still 0, to width height. This guy right here is going starting at width, so that's all the way over here, and then 0 on Y, and then down to width height. And then width, but 0y, down to, width and 0y to height, but 0x. So it's a little bit complicated, but we can just try these different lines, and then we can choose a random line. So this is the type of variation that's going to be a little bit different here. So I'm going to say if, and I'm just going to choose a random number. So I'm going to say random, and I'll go, I guess, from random to 4. Okay, so if I have a random number at 4, let's see what that would look like. So I'm going to open up the console here. And so random 4. Okay, so 1, 3, 0, 0, 0, 0, 2, 1, 2. Okay, each time we go, we can see that it's always 0, 3, 2, or 1. It never goes all the way to 4. So if we have random 4, we know that the value is either going to be 0, so we can say if, actually we need to assign this to a variable first. So I'm going to say random choice is random 4. Okay, so if random choice is greater than 0, or sorry, if random choice is less than 1, okay, so if it's less than 1, that means that this first number is 0. So if it's less than 1, let's draw this line here. Okay, so it's not always going to draw that line. It's going to draw it sometimes. Okay, now we see the effect of the animation because I haven't added my buttons yet. So let's just do frame rate is 10 for now so we don't get too much blinking. Okay, that's kind of fun anyway. So there's a random chance that we'll see that first line. Okay, the rest of the 3 lines always show up. So let's continue. So else if random choice is less than 2. So if it's not less than 1, it might be less than 2. So then let's do our second line. Okay, so now we see some of the lines, this one and this one, are still there, but other lines are appearing randomly. I'm going to increase the stroke weight a bit just to make this more visible. Alright, so let's do it again. Else if random choice is less than 3. We'll do our third line. And then let's just finish it off while we're here. Else if, and then we could actually just do else here because we know that 4 is our limit. So we don't really need to ask that. If it's not less than 1, not less than 2, and not less than 3, then it's definitely less than 4. So let's, whoops, do that. And so now we're seeing a random line each time. And if we put our cell size back to a larger number, now we're starting to see some kind of cool patterns. So that's kind of fun. It looks a little bit like a maze or something like that, although it probably wouldn't actually work as a maze. But we can start to see some kind of interesting patterns by choosing these different lines. And you don't have to put a line there. You could put different circles there. You can put different squares there. You could do more random choices inside of your random choices. So whatever you think would look interesting, go ahead and put those in there. So that's another way that you can add some randomness here. And so let's add in our user interface components. I'm just going to copy and paste those over from 3A since we already went over this. So I'm just going to grab my buttons and paste them in here. And I'm going to rename draw to pattern. And I'm going to copy my save image function as well. Okay, so now I can change the pattern and I can save it. And so I want to give the user some simple controls here, and I'm just going to, since I'm working with simple colors, I'm going to work with that. So that way we can see different patterns, but the user could actually do the colors. And so that'll be a really easy way to update the design. So let's start with our background color. We're just using a number there. So if we want to stick with grayscale, that's pretty easy. Let's create a slider. So we can say variable bg slider in the global scope. And then in setup, we'll just say bg slider, and we'll make a slider, create slider. And so the minimum value for a color is 0. The max value is 255. And then the current value, let's just put in 51. Okay, and let's give it a label. So I'll say create P. This is the background color. And so now I can just put the value of the BG slider into the background. So I'll say BG slider.value. And so now if we make the slider on the right, we get a white color, and then we get a black color. And so if we want to see it updating, we have to say BG slider.input and then call the pattern function. So now we can see, so you can see a kind of different contrast with that green color with the black versus the white. And so then for the green, updating that color is going to be a little trickier. Okay, so we can either give like a red and green and blue slider to the user so they can update all of them, or we could just give them one slider and then use some randomness to fill in the rest. So I'll just do an example of one slider, and then you guys, if you want to add more to it, you can always do that. So I'll say our red slider, and so I'll just do the red color. Okay, so create P red color. And this is going to look exactly the same as our BG slider because we have the same values. So red slider equals create slider, 0 to 255. The original color for that green, let's see if we can look that up. So I would go to HTML color codes. And this is just the basic green. So if I go to names and jump to the green section, here's green. And so the red is actually 0 for that. So just start at 0. And we'll say red slider.input. We'll call pattern. And so let's use our red, green, and blue. So for the stroke, so I'm going to say variable R is just equal to the red slider.value. So that's the red. And then for G, let's just give it a random number. So let's say 100 to 255. So we'll have a lot of green and then a little bit of blue just for balance. So I'll say like 50 to 150. And so then instead of stroke green, we can say stroke R, comma G, comma B. So then if we refresh this, whoops, I misspelled red. Okay, so now if we refresh it, we get some randomness, which is nice, but then if we add red, we get a lot more red. And if we take away red, we get just green and blue. So we can kind of change the design a bit. And so the user can find something that they like, and then click save, and save that pattern. So try adding other shapes here. Try adding other color sliders here. See if you can come up with some different examples. This one is another kind of like abstract pattern. So in my original examples, I kind of showed using the character. You can still use a character. You can kind of repeat different shapes. You might want to make like, you know, different patterns using like a face or an object or something like that. That's totally valid. Just in terms of showing some of the concepts, is easy to just use some basic shapes here. But remember, you can use as many shapes as you want, and you can kind of combine the shapes in different ways to get different types of patterns. So whatever you think will look interesting, you can think about what would you want to create a pattern for, maybe the background on your website or the background on your computer, or maybe the pattern for like a t-shirt or a bag, or you know, some kind of graphics or something like that. So you can start to get some inspiration from things like that. And then I would choose, again, there's 3A and 3B. So you can look at the code and see what looks more kind of like familiar to you, what you're more comfortable with, and then just go with one of those. You don't have to do both of them. But keep in mind that you can do different variations in either case. So I'm going to go ahead and commit those examples, and I'll post them in the YouTube video. So I'm going to say adds pattern variation examples and commit to master, and I'll push that. So I'll have links for those in the YouTube video. If you guys have any questions or need help with anything, remember to just chat me on Discord or email me, and we can set up a Blackboard meeting to do a screen share and go over whatever you're working on.